Today is a special video because I'm reviewing the new Supersapiens continuous glucose monitor, and it's something that I've been super excited about doing. I've been testing this device in loads of different scenarios: short versus long exercise, high intensity versus low intensity, and have tested the same sessions fasted and well fueled and compared the data. And by the way, some of that testing wasn't particularly pleasant, as it was pretty intense. And I've also been using it to track my food and see what I can learn from that. So basically, I've tried to cover a variety of different uses which triathletes might have for it to see whether it's actually helpful and whether it's something that could inform training and racing. So before we get into the real nitty-gritty, there's a couple of important things to say. Firstly, I'm not sponsored or affiliated with Supersapiens in any way. I bought the products with my own money so that I could test them and do as unbiased a review as possible for you. And secondly, just a bit of context. I'm a sport nutritionist, but I also work as an advanced clinical practitioner in general practice or family medicine. By background, I'm a specialist paramedic and I have full medicine prescribing rights. So basically, this Supersapiens concept is something that interests me from a sport and health point of view. Now, last up here, I've put chapters for you in the video playback bar. I've tried to put this video in a logical order for you to watch as if you were considering buying it through to analysing the data. So if you've got a part that you're really interested in, then you can just skip to that. But I've learned a fair few lessons and had some pretty frustrating moments, and I'm hoping that I can stop that happening for you. Phones which aren't compatible with their app, having sensors disconnect and then disappear, that sort of thing. By the time you're watching this video, they may have sorted some of these things out. Who knows? Alright, so with that out of the way, let's get stuck in. So I guess the first step on our journey is to talk about what this thing actually does and how it could be helpful. The Supersapiens device monitors our glucose level and reports it back to us. The concept is, by knowing this glucose level and how it changes, we can better fuel our training, recovery, and our racing. And the idea behind that is that glucose is the main source of energy which our muscle cells use during high intensity exercise, including racing. So by tracking it, we can make sure that we are at an optimum level of glucose to provide our muscles with energy. And this is what Supersapiens themselves say about it, and you can pause the video and read it if you want. Now, the concept of CGM isn't new at all. Diabetics have used it for years to track their glucose levels and to help manage their diabetes. But it's now making its way into sport, and Supersapiens are one of several companies at the forefront of this. Supersapiens don't actually make the CGM itself, they just provide the app and the infrastructure. The sensor is made by Abbott, who make monitors specifically for diabetics, but this one has been adapted for sport use. The main difference with the Supersapiens device is that you can live stream the data minute by minute. Most diabetic devices use near-field communication, and you have to scan it manually and then log your readings, and there's no live streaming of the data. The other important thing to mention here is that CGMs like this monitor the glucose level in your interstitial fluid. We won't go into that in too much detail, but the main point is that the glucose reading in this interstitial fluid may be different to a capillary blood glucose reading, like if you do a finger prick test. Remember this because this does play a part when we look at the positives and negatives of this device. So next on our list is the application of this device. To be honest, it's very easy to do, so we're not going to spend a long time on this. They give you step-by-step instructions on the app, which is perfect. It genuinely wasn't painful at all, and I didn't actually feel it, so if you're worried about that, then don't be. No, I'm joking. You have to replace the biosensors every 14 days, and when you're getting close, you get a warning letting you know that it's on its way out. So I found the device to be comfortable pretty much all of the time. I occasionally had a little bit of an ache around the area, but it was non-specific and not really troublesome. The time I noticed it most was when I was on the bike. On bumpy roads, and if you're jolting around a little bit, it became a bit more noticeable and maybe a little bit more uncomfortable, but still really not an issue at all. So you get 2 Supersapiens activity patches per sensor, or 4 per month. These help to protect the CGM so that it doesn't get damaged during activities. I found that the first patch lasted 5 days, second patch lasted a week, although it was peeling after about 4 days and I just kept it on, and the same with the third and fourth. I think the patches are worthwhile, especially while you aren't used to the CGM, as they protect it against when you inevitably walk through a doorway because you haven't remembered that you've got a little bit of extra something sticking out of your arm. And just be careful about when you take a t-shirt off, because I found that was when I was most likely to catch it and pull it off. So first things first, when it comes to connectivity, there are some phones which do not work with the sensor and/or the app. And this isn't made clear unless you go into the help desk section and search around. You don't get any warnings when you place an order, so you could easily be very disappointed once you actually get it. This list might change, so I'd recommend checking the help section to make sure that your phone is compatible. I have sent Supersapiens a message about this whole issue, and they've said that they're working on making this more visible. Now, when it came to actually connecting the CGM, I had a bit of trouble. I followed the instructions and the picture said to place the middle of your phone next to it, but I followed this and it just wouldn't connect. I faffed around for a while, discovered some phones didn't work, and got pretty disheartened and worried. I then Googled where the near field communication connection was on my phone and realized it was actually at the top, so I then held it there and it worked. So if you're having trouble connecting your phone to the sensor, just double check where your NFC sensor is, because it seems to need to be placed almost exactly over it. I've had a few periods of it not wanting to connect or seeming to forget my biosensor and all my data. This seemed to happen when my activity got uploaded to the Supersapiens app before I had actually reconnected the CGM and uploaded my glucose data. So for example, after a swim, if I didn't have my phone on me to live stream the data, I had to connect it back again after. But if my phone connected to my watch like it normally would, it would upload the training session to Training Peaks, and that would then push it to Supersapiens. I had this happen 3 times where it wouldn't upload the missing glucose data once a workout had already gone on, and it only did once I logged out of the app, restarted my phone, reconnected, waited 20 or 30 minutes. It always reconnected eventually and I didn't lose any data, but it was pretty frustrating at times. In order to get the most out of the device as Supersapiens intend, you have to live stream the data. And this is so that you can see what your glucose readings are doing and fuel accordingly. We'll get into whether that's actually any good later on, but what's really important to say is that you have to connect the CGM through your phone via a Bluetooth link to see the data live. Once you have a live link through your phone, you can live stream it to your watch or to your bike computer, but unless you have your phone link going, you can't do this, which means that in a triathlon, this is a no-go because you're not going to have your phone on you. Unless you buy the energy band, which is currently priced at €159. This allows you to live stream the data from the CGM straight to the energy band. Now, I'm not particularly keen on this approach overall, because in order to use the device as intended, you have to buy something else on top of already spending about £120 a month on the monitors. Now, I understand this is a pioneering bit of kit and they have to make a profit, but it just seems a bit meh for me. Another really important thing to mention here is that you can only record up to 8 hours worth of data if you don't have a connection to your phone in place. And by the way, if you noticed I'm wearing different clothes and probably a slightly different setup, it's because I forgot to record this part during the main bit. So I thought I would just do another quick recording and just slot this seamlessly in. So what that means is if you head out for an all-day event, so cycling or a long-distance triathlon, and you're not connected to your phone, then you'll only be able to get the previous 8 hours worth of data because it just wipes itself continuously. Cool, so back seamlessly to other me. You can set the Supersapiens app up to receive data from Garmin or Training Peaks, and I tried both of these and they worked fine, and it was easy to set up, so just follow the instructions on the app. Once you upload to one of those platforms, it pushes it to Supersapiens, which then analyzes your glucose data for the activity. Alright, so let's talk about the accuracy of this device. I wanted to make sure the CGM was correct, so I also tested my blood capillary readings with 2 medical glucose monitors at different points, which meant lots of stabbing of my fingers to check that the readings were comparable. Oh, what I do in the name of science. I found that for the most part, the readings were all within the right ballpark, and in general, they were good enough for me to recommend it from an accuracy point of view. There were times when the accuracy was worse, and this is important to highlight. Now, remember before I mentioned about the differences between blood glucose readings from your finger versus the interstitial readings from something like a CGM? Well, the interstitial fluid readings generally have a bit of a lag time, which means they can be slower to respond and may go a little bit funky compared to what your blood glucose is actually doing. I definitely found that the monitor seemed to be most inaccurate at the extreme of readings, but it was pretty good otherwise. Supersapiens mentioned this in the help desk section, and I think what they say here is right, in that the trend is just as important, or perhaps more important than the actual reading. After you put on your biosensor, you get taken through a walkthrough type guide. There are different topics which you can learn about the importance of glucose and how it impacts training. This was something that I was really pleased to see, and honestly, if you actually read the topics and take the information in, then you can make some really positive changes to your training and your fueling. Some of the lingo is a little bit heavily biased towards the Supersapiens ecosystem, where I feel that plain English may have been better, but whatever. They've clearly put effort in to give you resources to help you, and I think this is great. So now let's get into the performance side of things. The first thing that we need to mention is something that Supersapiens call the glucose performance zone. The idea behind this is that your glucose should be at higher readings than normal during racing and intense exercise to fuel your muscles. More glucose in the blood, more glucose available for your muscles to use. Now, the theory here is sound, but we'll talk about the practical applications of it. After every activity, you get a glucose score. Supersapiens grades your activity based on your glucose data and whether there's anything like significant drops or patterns which it thinks are or aren't beneficial. You can also mark each activity with a perceived effort score, and the idea is that you build up a bank of activities with glucose scores and intensity scores to see what your glucose does when you're performing well or under certain conditions. The glucose performance zone is set between 110 and 180 milligrams per deciliter by default, but the aim is for you to identify the levels where you perform best and then try to keep your glucose levels there. And as a bit of context, a normal blood glucose reading is between about 70 to 140 milligrams per deciliter, or 4 to 7.8 millimoles per litre. And your body naturally regulates this. It will go above it and below it at times, especially after food, and that is totally normal. The final thing to say here is that any exercise under about 30 minutes just isn't worthwhile data-wise because it's too short to get any meaningful insights. From about 45 minutes and above, you do get some, but again, it's still not loads, and we'll discuss that. So, with that out of the way, let's start looking at some data. Let's start by looking at 2 short, easy sessions, one 40-minute run and a 45-minute ride. This is the sort of data that you get afterwards. You get the glucose score out of 100 and you get some other info below it. With an easy aerobic 45-minute session, there's not really too much that you can get from this. It's not high intensity and there shouldn't be any chance of bonking, so in general I didn't really find this useful. So let's move on to some high intensity sessions, and I'm going to show you the data of these sessions and then we're going to talk about it all afterwards. So this was a run workout where I did 10 400 meter intervals with 45 seconds rest. According to the glucose performance zones which I had set, which I left as the default, I was actually outside of my glucose performance zone the whole time and instead was in what they called the low intensity zone. Now let's have a look at 2 45-minute bike high intensity interval sessions where I did the same workout. But the difference being one of these sessions was well fueled, the other I did fasted in the morning after having a low carb dinner the night before. Now I normally would not advise athletes to follow this low carb approach with high intensity exercise, but I wanted to see what the glucose results were and whether a poor fueling approach would show up. Now, which of these do you think was fasted and which do you think was well fueled? I can tell you that the fed one felt far better and I had much more in the tank. And during the fasted session, I felt pretty awful and just about finished the session. If there had been a few more intervals, I probably wouldn't have finished it. So this is which is fasted and which was well fueled. Did you get it right? Now let's move on to another example. This was the same ride outdoors. In one, I had breakfast a few hours before, but then no nutrition on the bike at all. And in the other, I had breakfast and I fueled it properly while cycling, with gels and a carb drink. Can you guess which one of these was which? Now for context, in the first half of this ride, there were 2 hills which were pretty steep, which took about 10 minutes to climb, followed by some rolling sections afterwards. In the second half of both of these rides, I did about 8 pretty hard sprints, followed by an all-out 5-second power effort at the end of the ride. My hope was that by the end of the ride, I should be starting to flag in the ride without any nutrition, and I wanted to see whether that was reflected in the glucose scores or in my readings near the end. In the ride where I didn't take any nutrition, my 5-second power at the end of the 2 rides was 849, and in the one where I took nutrition, it was 899. Now that's a difference of 6%, which is actually quite a lot. And there are, of course, multiple explanations for this, but it gives a bit of context. So let's go through one more bike and then some swims before we discuss these results. This was an 85k ride where I had breakfast and fueled well during the ride. I actually fueled it almost exactly like I would fuel a race to see what my glucose readings did, and this was the result. As you can see, I spent 48% of the time in the default glucose performance zone. Now, these swims were unexciting as far as data goes. These were 3 of my swims, which were between about 45 minutes and 60 minutes. This was the same sort of picture for all of my swims, and there wasn't much to take from the data during the sessions itself. Now, there's data during the exercise, but there's also the pre and post data too. You can see this section at the bottom, which tells you your trailing average and your trailing variability for the past 12 and 24 hours. And I think these are great metrics because they allow you to see what your glucose readings were going into any workout. It is possible as well to see low carbohydrate intake reflected in this and conversely high carbohydrate intake too. However, this isn't always the case, and that's just due to your body naturally regulating its glucose levels. So I guess we need to evaluate things a bit here. In general, I had mixed feelings towards the CGM with regards to the data that we've just been over. In my opinion, I couldn't really tell a difference between fasted or fed workouts, well-fueled versus under-fueled. My fasted high-intensity session had a better score than my well-fueled session, but I definitely performed better in the well-fueled one. My glucose score was slightly higher in some of my well-fueled sessions, but this wasn't always the case, and it wasn't like there was a clear, oh wow, I fueled badly there. And this is actually a big concern for me. I wouldn't advise fasted high-intensity training to athletes, and instead I would advise that athletes fuel well during these harder or longer sessions. But the data I have so far didn't really give me the confidence to suggest that the monitor could delineate good from bad fueling for my workouts. And I worry that that could lead to chronic underfueling. Now, I don't chronically underfuel, so I don't know whether things would look different in someone who did, and that's worth considering, because my results might be quite different to somebody else's. But then my concern going the other way is that the glucose score might lead people to poor dietary choices. My score was often pretty low, but I didn't underfuel for most of them. In order for me to get into that glucose performance zone, I would have to try to consume far more carbohydrates and probably more simple carbohydrates too, which I didn't need to do. My concern is that without the knowledge or context, seeing this glucose score sort of metric after every workout might push people into fueling with simple carbs too frequently and when it's just not necessary. Now, you might have remembered me saying that you can set your own glucose performance zone based on your activities and how you feel. And looking at my data, I should probably be lowering that threshold down because I don't seem to get into that performance zone particularly frequently. Yet, I performed well. However, if I did lower that threshold, that would basically just be saying that I perform best when my glucose level is in a normal physiological range which my body regulates itself, in which case the device doesn't really add anything. Now, in fairness, Supersapiens discuss a lot of my concerns with this if you click Learn More on your event analytics. They explain that performance is multifactorial and that there can be good scores and bad workouts, and bad scores and good workouts. The aim from Supersapiens is to minimize the chance that fueling is the contributor to bad workouts. I think that is totally right, and it's an excellent approach. I suppose my concern is that there's just so much data and intricacies that it kind of becomes a bit useless. And on that note, I'm not sure how useful it is if you're already consuming carbohydrates during training or racing, which is in the ballpark of current nutrition guidance. I don't think it has enough sensitivity for me to be able to think, I need to have an extra gel there, or I had one too many gels there. However, it is definitely not all bad, and I think there are a lot of positives too. I mentioned this earlier about the Learning Hub and that it's got a lot of awesome info in it. And one topic which I think is great is about recovery and nutrition after exercise. How often do you really prioritize nutrition after exercise? How commonly do you think, yeah, I'll sort food, and by the time you get round to it, you've left it an hour or more before you eat? Well, a CGM absolutely helps with that, and prioritizing recovery after exercise is a massive positive. By focusing on nutrition after exercise, you promote improvements from the actual workout itself, and you're refueling to perform well in the next session too. With the CGM, you can clearly see your glucose level dropping after workouts, and the time that it takes for it to come back up again after you've eaten. So you get an objective reading, which you just can't argue with, and the sooner the better for refueling, and this really helps with it. You can't lie about how well and how quickly you'll refuel when you can see that it's clearly not the case. Now, I briefly mentioned this earlier, but you can label the effort and activities and create a database by doing so, and I think this could be really worthwhile. If you also label your food choices, then I think it may be possible to see how fueling in the hours before your exercise impacts your performance and your glucose scores. Now, I suspect this would be a lot of work, and as far as I'm aware, there isn't actually any data to support this in terms of glucose readings. But I think it's reasonable to consider that you could fine-tune your pre-exercise nutrition choices by keeping a log of effort and glucose readings going into exercise and then during your sessions. You'd have to make sure to rate your effort before you've looked at your glucose data to reduce the placebo effect. Along with that, you could use the macronutrient data from your food events to see how nutrition could be correlated with things like tummy upset or stitches. Now, I also think that having the data to be able to share could be great, and it's easy to do so. If you have a nutritionist who you could pass the data to, they could look for insights, and this could be a really worthwhile avenue. Again, it's those objective readings and putting effort into recording data like macronutrients that may make this worthwhile. Okay, so there is one more performance element that we need to talk through, which I thought I would do after that evaluation, and that's because I'm currently unsure how meaningful it is. And I wanted to talk about the positives and negatives of everyday training first. I'm also going to go into this in far more detail in another video because this one will probably already be long enough. I did two 60-minute power tests under different nutrition conditions. One was fasted after a low-carb dinner the night before, and the other one was well-fueled. The idea was that there should be a clear difference in performance between the two tests. Now, these were my glucose scores and glucose readings for the 60-minute power tests. Which do you think was which? And which one do you think I averaged more watts during, based on the glucose data? Now, this one here was the fasted effort, and this one was the well-fueled one. And my average power between the two tests was only 1 watt difference. Now, this is all absolutely fascinating for me. I didn't look at my glucose data during the efforts because I didn't want it to affect my performance. You can see in my well-fueled effort, my glucose level started high, dropped super low, and then recovered. In my fasted effort, it started lower, but climbed over the 60 minutes. Now let's put my power profile on, and it gets a bit funkier. As I said, I didn't know what my glucose was doing during these efforts. In my fasted effort, I just gradually increased my wattage over the 60 minutes. In my well-fueled effort, I started where I eventually averaged at, but I had to drop it after about 10 minutes because it felt way too hard. I then tried to work into it again, but had to drop it because it just felt too difficult. You can see this period where I had to drop it and tried to work into it and had to drop it again seems to correlate with my glucose level dropping. Now, I have so much to say on this because I find it so interesting, but I need to do this justice and delve into it properly, and that'll be in another video. So the quick plug here is to make sure that you press subscribe if you haven't already, and the notification icon to get an alert when I release it. And give the video a like while you're at it. But the short story is that I need to do more testing to find out whether I can actually replicate this finding and whether this drop in glucose truly affects my performance or not. But this is potentially an extremely useful finding for me while using the Supersapiens device. Regardless of basically anything else, the potential to pick up this sort of thing has significant implications on racing performance. However, because I don't have enough data at the moment, I can't go too heavy on this. So as much as it pains me to say, I think we have to leave this as a possible game changer and move on to the food side of things. So while most people think about the Supersapiens ecosystem in terms of performance and optimizing fueling during training and racing, it is far more than that. Your everyday nutrition and food choices matter for long-term performance, and a CGM can influence this. There's some really good info in the Learning Hub, although personally I would love it if it went even further and gave more insights into how food affects us. You're encouraged to add food events where you can add macronutrients and create tags to analyze meals at a later date. And then you can see the trends of your glucose and what happens with different foods and macronutrients. Now, one great example of what you can do is where Supersapiens suggests that you have a lunch and then you have the same lunch with a short walk afterwards. They also suggest to have the same lunch, but to experiment with fat, with fiber and protein, and to see how this affects your glucose readings. Now, this might seem a bit odd to you, and you might wonder what this has got to do with triathlon performance. Well, this is essentially giving you a visual guide and teaching you about the good core principles of nutrition, and I absolutely love it. Healthy eating and healthy behaviours are important for long-term health and performance, so I absolutely think it plays a part. And I think something like a CGM has the power to improve eating habits. Now, as a personal example here, I noticed a big glucose spike after one of my regular meals which I eat, but it's a meal which I don't put much thought into. The spike in itself isn't bad as such, but it made me question my meal and the components of it. I realised that actually I could tweak it a little bit by being a bit more reasonable on the carb intake and adding a little more protein and fat. Generally healthier, more balanced, and more in line with appropriate fueling for the training that I was doing. And that sort of outcome while using a CGM is awesome. The Learning Hub also mentions that going over 140 milligrams per deciliter regularly is bad for long-term health, and again, I'm really glad that they're highlighting this. While it isn't quite as black and white as that, it's important to encourage a healthy, balanced diet, and if you regularly see glucose readings spiking high, your baseline trending upwards, then this is something that you should potentially act on. And while Supersapiens do mention that their device isn't to be used to diagnose or manage something like diabetes, having an understanding of the bigger picture is great for triathletes. As an example of how different foods can affect your glucose readings, here are two meals with the same amount of calories. One is much more carb heavy, and the other has less carbs and more protein and fat. You can see the difference in glucose readings, and I think that this sort of visual understanding of what food does to your body is fantastic. It makes you actively think about your food and could promote healthier food choices and habits, and that for me is a huge win. I would actually love a bit more focus on the health side of things, like helpful behavioural nudges, but I realise not everyone may think the same way as me. Anyway, as a bit of a sum up from a food point of view, I genuinely think this is a powerful tool for triathletes. Perhaps not something that needs to be used forever, but certainly to help you understand the food that you're eating and what effect it can have on your glucose levels. Of course, food is far more than just glucose readings, but my hope is that it makes triathletes think about overall healthy food choices. So that was a lot of information and stuff that we went through then. If you managed to get that far, then kudos, because I'm not sure that I would have. And honestly, I think we're actually just scratching the surface of this. The relationship of your glucose readings and how it affects your performance is complex. Truth be told, it is so complex that I'm not sure how useful the data actually is and whether I can make appropriate recommendations from it. But I think the potential is there, and it's something that I'm willing to trial further. I think it's also fair to say that everyone's physiology and everyone's diet is different. So some users might get some very different results to me and also have some real eureka moments with this. Overall, I've really enjoyed using it and I'm going to continue testing it. We'll do some deeper dives into exercise of different intensities and lengths, analyse some race data, and look at how a CGM could be used during something like a carbohydrate load before a race. So that pretty much brings us to the end of today's video. If you've got any questions or comments or have used a Supersapiens monitor, then let me know in the comments. And if you did find this video useful, then I would really appreciate it if you smash the thumbs up button, because it took a bloody long time to make. And if you haven't already, then do make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification icon, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.